I'm Atrell Nishar in Washington. We're learning chilling new details about how Vance Luther Boelter allegedly carried out what authorities say was a politically motivated attack in Minnesota that left a state lawmaker and her husband dead. Another lawmaker and his wife were shot and are recovering. Federal officials now reveal Boelter allegedly stopped at the home of two additional lawmakers. Vance Luther Boelter making his first appearance in federal court Monday, less than 24 hours after his capture ended the largest manhunt in Minnesota history. Suspected of carrying out what authorities call a politically motivated, murderous rampage.
Boelter stalked his victims like prey.
Federal investigators say Boelter first went to State Senator John Hoffman's home in the Minneapolis suburb of Champlin, pretending to be a police officer. He allegedly shot Hoffman and his wife repeatedly. Both are expected to survive. Then, officials allege at 2:24 a.m. Saturday, Boelter arrived at the home of another state rep in nearby Maple Grove.
Fortunately, the state representative was not home. She and her family were gone on vacation.
Boelter then allegedly drove in his car, made to look like a police vehicle, toward the home of another state senator in New Hope. But local police, having heard about the shooting at the Hoffmans, beat him there to do a wellness check.
Boelter then traveled to Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, and the home of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman.
Authorities say Brooklyn Park police arrived shortly after Boelter.
When Boelter saw the officers get out of the car, he drew his weapon and began firing. He rushed into the house through the front door, firing into it. And when he entered, he murdered Representative Hortman and her husband, Mark.
Boelter's federal charges, expected to be prosecuted first, include murder, firearms offenses, and stalking.
Will we see the death penalty? It's too early to tell. That is one of the options for several other charges, though.
On Saturday, local authorities filed second-degree murder and attempted murder charges against Boelter, allowing them to get a nationwide arrest warrant.
These are the highest charges we can file by complaint, and it needed to be done quickly to get the warrant out. Mr. Boelter was taken into state custody, and our office intends to pursue first-degree murder charges against Mr. Boelter.
Now that Boelter is in custody, law enforcement says they can start the hard work of putting together a motive and determining whether the suspected assassin is part of a broader network. In Washington, I'm Atrell Nishar.
Today, an appeals court in California will hear arguments on the challenge to President Trump's deployment of National Guard troops, and the suspect charged in the murders of a Minnesota lawmaker and her husband face a judge for the first time. Joining us to discuss, the former superintendent of the Chicago PD and retired special agent in charge at the FBI, Jody Weiss. Good morning to you, sir. Great to see you as always.
Good morning.
Let's start with the case against Vance Boelter. What is next for him in this case?
You know, Jan, there's a lot of work that has to be done still. They're looking for a few things. Number one, you want to know what his motive was. That's really important. And then you also want to determine, was he acting alone? Are there other people involved? Because that could address how you would then form your threat matrix or your security threat. So right now, there's several things that are going to be going on simultaneously. First thing, you want to look for all the physical evidence. They're going to be going through the vehicle, his house, his phone with search warrants. You know, and they're all going to try to tie that evidence back to the crime scene. Then you've got the digital examination. Think what might be on that phone, the messages, the phone calls before this incident took place. They'll be looking at his social media posts, if he has any. They'll be looking at his search histories. You know, he did a lot of planning on this, and that will all tie to his motive and what he was doing ahead of time. You're also, by going through that digital evidence, you're going to determine his network, and that is really important because we have to be sure that there's no other threats out there. So once you find his network, that's when a lot of work starts. The interviews, interview after interview after interview, because you want to find out who might else be tied to this, if there is any other threat that could affect politicians throughout the country. So they're looking for more.
Yeah,
and also acting alone.
Don't you think, whether or not he acted alone, which right now they're saying he did, but don't you think he was on the radar of law enforcement at some point?
You know, it's hard to say. You know, you go back to the whole thing with the FBI, they have a small window to look at somebody, and they've got to make a call whether, you know, you're actually a threat or not, because, you know, resources, you can't keep all these cases open all the time. But, you know, he understood law enforcement. He was in the tactical world. He'd been involved with government. So I don't know if it just popped up. We don't know. And that's what they're going to determine. Like, why, if he wasn't known, should he have been known?
Right,
and if he should have been known, why wasn't he known?
Right.
So we
All
just
these
have to wait
questions.
for the investigation.
Federal appeals court in San Francisco going to hear the case whether the president can actually keep control of the California National Guard, which ultimately, as we know, could end up in the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the reason this even began was because initially the LAPD was very slow to respond to these riots. The president obviously felt an obligation to protect these federal ICE agents. What's been your thoughts on this challenge to the president's decision to send in the Guard? Why wouldn't any law enforcement welcome the help of any law enforcement?
And my first thought is the case should be tossed. I mean, Title 10 clearly gives the authority to the president to deploy the National Guard, to federalize the National Guard when federal assets, either structures or people, are threatened. You had ICE agents that were being threatened just trying to do their job, carrying out search warrants. You also had the LA police chief say, we're overwhelmed. So if that doesn't support, federalizing the National Guard. However, I do agree on one thing. He should not have had to have done this. If you had a governor and mayor that cared about their city and cared about protecting their city and its people, they would have moved forward and deployed the National Guard right away. But when you do this, Jan, you have to have a clear mission for the Guard. They can't enforce laws, so you have to give them a clear mission what to do. Had it been me, and I think Jim McDonnell did this, I would have pushed more for mutual aid. I go back to election night when President Obama was elected in Chicago. We didn't call him the National Guard. We didn't see that as a threat, but we had all the surrounding communities send in their law enforcement departments to help us in the surrounding areas around Chicago and the community. So there's other ways to do it, but I think President Trump was on rock solid ground to do this.
And you just mentioned the mayor and the governor there, who obviously have been at odds. You just mentioned the LAPD chief, who clearly did not have a handle on the situation, needed some help. Weren't you often at odds with the mayor as well when you were in Chicago? Were there times where you just wanted politicians to stay in their lane and let law enforcement do what they need to do?
Well, I think you always want to do that. I was really blessed, and this is 100% true. Mayor Daley gave me a really free hand to run this stuff, and I learned one thing at the FBI: information, feed the beast. We sent him notes probably every day of what we were doing, so he was fully apprised. And I think a smart politician wants to have that level of separation. So if something goes bad, he can point to me at a presser and say, talk to him, he's the police chief. But in Los Angeles, you do not have the quality politicians that you had with Richard M. Daley.
Very true. Former superintendent of the Chicago PD and retired special agent in charge at the FBI, Jody Weiss. Great to see you as always. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Atra El-Nashar in Capitol Hill. Members of Congress received a security briefing Tuesday in light of the shootings of 2 Minnesota lawmakers and their spouses outside Minneapolis that authorities say were politically motivated. There are renewed calls for increased security for lawmakers and for lawmakers themselves to tone down their rhetoric. Suspected Minnesota assassin Vance Luther Boelter is behind bars, and for some members of Congress, the chilling reality is setting in that their names were on a list authorities say they found in his SUV, like Democratic Congresswoman Hillary Scholten of Michigan.
I got the call Sunday night, of course, while the shooter was still at large.
Immediately after the attacks, Democratic leadership requested Capitol Police provide extra security for Minnesota's congressional delegation.
We are seeing a dramatic increase in threats against senators, congressmen, public officials.
It was just Monday a man in Georgia was indicted for allegedly threatening sexual violence against Republican Senators Deb Fischer and Ted Cruz and Cruz's family. In the past year, there were 2 attempted assassinations of then-candidate Trump and an arson attack at the residence of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. Usually, a president calls a governor after a tragedy in their state. President Trump issued a statement condemning the violence in Minnesota, but says calling Governor Tim Walz, also a former Democratic vice presidential nominee, would be a waste of time.
I think the governor of Minnesota is so whacked out, I'm not calling.
Hours after the attacks, Senator Mike Lee posted claims on X that the suspect was a Marxist, implying Democrats were to blame for what happened. The suspect's roommate later told reporters he was a Trump supporter. Minnesota Senator Tina Smith, a friend of slain state representative Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark, confronted Lee about this Monday.
He has a powerful platform. He should not be using it to spread misinformation and to basically make a joke of the murder of people.
Leaders on Capitol Hill are looking at increasing funding for Capitol Police, which is requesting an additional $176 million for 2026, which would bring their budget to almost $1 billion. Capitol Police say in 2024 alone, they investigated more than 9,400 concerning statements and direct threats against members of Congress, their families, and staff, up from 8,000 the year before. On Capitol Hill, I'm Atrell Nashar.